the, what is it, August 23rd meeting of the Act 65 Working Group of the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel. Let us introduce ourselves. I will go around the screen. Evan, you're first.
Okay, I'm Evan Meenan with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Jeff. Jeff, you're muted.
Some people would like that always to be the case, but I'll turn mine on. Jeff Jones, I guess one of the original appointees at large, more or less at this point.
Right. Thank you. Tyler.
Good evening, everyone. Tyler Allen, Department of Children and Families. And this is actually my first time joining the working group. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join the past couple of iterations, but I am glad to be here.
Thanks. Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca Turner from the Defender General's Office.
Okay. David.
Hi, everybody. David Chair, representing the Attorney General's Office.
Good. Okay, now my computer has decided to do something weird. Witchy, is that you?
It is me.
It is.
Myself? Yeah, hello. Yeah, Wicierto, pronounce he, him, his, they, them, theirs. Athens resident. Yes, that is in Vermont. And data warehouse specialist. Thanks.
Great. And for some reason, floating over letters right now is not bringing anything up for me. IL.
Hi, Ian Loris. I'm Aton's summer assistant.
Got it. Hi. TA.
I think that might be me.
Yes. Susanna.
Hi, good evening. Susanna Davis, Racial Equity Director.
Sheila.
Good evening, everyone. Sheila Linton, she, her, hers, Root Social Justice Center, appointee at large.
Great. And O2.
That's the Orca people.
Oh, okay.
Orca Media.
If I have forgotten anyone, please let me know. Or like
Hey, Don Robbins on the phone. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Robin.
Well, hi.
All right.
And Aton, hi. It's Monica. We talked already, but I'm here too.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's just.
It's okay.
That's okay. And Karen's here too.
Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Yep, the computer's just not doing it tonight.
We'll help you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, to begin, as you know, I took the thoughts that were forwarded to me by all of you and started in on writing a draft that would be specifically focused on questions 2 and 3 of Act 65, or of that particular page of Act 65. I can't remember what the page was, somewhere between 18 and 23 of the Act. That was what we had decided to do. Not last week, because that was the holiday, but the week before was to focus on questions 2 and 3. There was broad feeling that would help us answer the first question, where the Bureau should be situated, taking into account the necessity for independence and the advantages and disadvantages of being a standalone body or being housed in state government. 4 and 5, I didn't touch, and nobody else did in what they sent me. So I sent that along. It dawned on me at the very last minute, like literally half an hour ago, that I didn't resend Rebecca's drawing, but I figured we all had that. that might have been really a mistake on my part. And if so, I'm really sorry. But I remember that from 3 weeks ago that we all had that drawing. And so I just made an assumption, which may have been very wrong. But then I also, as you know, put in Monica's drawing. I did not try to synthesize any of that, the drawings. That is something that I'm going to leave to someone else to do, because I'm really good with abstract thought. If you give me a picture of something, I don't know what to do with it. It baffles me. So for those of you who are visual learners, this is your moment to shine, because I fail miserably. So I was just hoping that we could have a discussion based upon the draft of what's been written, talk about its failings, talk about things we like about it, things that are left out of it, things that need to be put in it, so on and so forth, and then lead the discussion on to points 1. And after that, I'm hoping to talk about points 4 and 5, which I think needs to bring in Karen and Robin. Those are the points that Mo Stein had been talking about very early in this process, where we had discussed that we might well we needed to have these questions that we're working on now finished before we got to those. Does that sound like a reasonable strategy for this evening? Okay, well then, given that I came up with the contrivance of the of what people have written, I'm going to stop talking now and let you all weigh in.
Well, I guess someone's got to go first. And I will preface my remarks with I think you've already received at least one ATOM, but a big thank you for taking the first crack at this. It's usually a thankless job, but thanks to you. So I appreciated it.
You're welcome.
And, overall, I thought there was some good language in there. But, as I was reading it again, I had a question which I know I've asked before, but I'm going to put it on the table again by citing a couple of statutes that I went back and revisited. And I guess my point really goes to the first question we're supposed to answer, which is, where should this be housed? But some of the language that you drafted, Eitan, is really, really similar to some language in the enabling legislation for the executive director of racial equity. For example, there's a statute that says there is created within the executive branch the position of executive director of racial equity to identify and work to eradicate systematic racism within state government. And then there's also a statutory requirement for the director to manage and oversee the statewide collection of race-based data to determine the nature and scope of racial discrimination within all systems of state government. And then a final statute that requires the director to work collaboratively with state agencies and departments to gather relevant existing data and records necessary to carry out the purposes of this chapter and to develop best practices for remediating systematic racial disparities throughout state government. And then there's, even some language regarding the confidentiality of information, which I think is something else that we're supposed to make recommendations on. So it just seems to me like there already is an entity in state government that is supposed to be doing some of what the Bureau, I think, is going to be designed to do. And I know that there was some concerns expressed last meeting about whether or not that entity was independent enough or whether or not it had sufficient resources. But it seems like, we could make recommendations that those two things should be adequately addressed, so that it could carry out its existing statutory obligations, the obligations of the Bureau, while maintaining a sufficient amount of independence and a sufficient amount of resources to get the job done correctly. So that was sort of my initial overarching thought.
Okay. Thank you. I need to put on chat, don't I? Because I won't know who's got their hand up or anything. Excuse me. Okay, there I am. Thank you. Rebecca, your hand is up. Did I surprise you?
No, it's good. I'm finding the buttons. I actually wasn't going to address, Evan, your point. Thanks for jumping in and going to number one, in terms of, so your comment or your suggestion is we think of the entity being placed, the Bureau, for calling it simplistically, the Bureau should be placed in Susanna Davis's director. Is that what you're saying here?
Well,
I was focused on three and Eitan's comment, but Eitan, do you want to start there, Eitan, a discussion on this, or do you want to go?
And I was kind of making that suggestion, and I don't want this suggestion to be perceived as saying that Susanna's office should just, house this entity and should just do the work in its current configuration. If her office needs to be reformatted or retooled, or it needs more resources, then that might be a worthwhile consideration to avoid having multiple entities with overlapping or conflicting jurisdiction that could make resource allocation less efficient and more costly.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to write on this as you're talking and put notes in. In terms of where to go, I feel like start wherever. If you want to talk about number 3 or number 2, let's just go. I don't feel like there needs to be a particular order to this, because it's all sort of intergenerative, if you will. Monica?
Yeah, you go ahead. I'm ceding the floor for now.
Okay, thanks. Well, and I think part of the reason I did that drawing that Eitan sent out was mostly for myself, was to sort of understand the way I was thinking about it, because to me it does hopefully help us get to where the Bureau should be situated. And in the drawing, what I was pointing out was that there's data that's going to come from the executive branch, that's going to come from the judiciary, and that's going to come from a bunch of outside entities, or standalone entities, and that at least for those departments that are within the executive branch, there's going to need to be some very strict rules around the sharing of data and how the data goes from DCF, DOC over to the Bureau. And when I was thinking about that, that means ADS has to be involved from a structural component, and that ADS could provide the support that they provide. Again, not that it should be housed there, but they would have to be involved. So that just kept leading me to needing the Bureau to be housed somewhere within a state government organization, in order to also help provide, the things that you were talking about the last meeting, Eitan, like who's going to sign the bills or order whatever needs to be ordered and all that. That administrative function has to happen somewhere, unless, you know, the legislature is going to really create a very large standalone entity, which I just don't see it doing.
No, I don't.
And so, you know, in some ways, I think question one helps, you know, they're all linked together. I think we would write the mission slightly differently depending on where the Bureau was housed. So that's why I was connecting those things as well, and led me to the drawing. But overall, in terms of the way you put everything together, I like all the concepts that are on this document. And I think we could really refine it if we kind of got a little bit more involved in the other question.
Yeah, I agree. Witchy.
Yeah, so I kind of really, as soon as the Office of Racial Equity got mentioned, it kind of really made sense to me that that would be where it's housed. I feel like, you know, that office is really in charge of making sure there's racial equity in Vermont and administrating it, and I feel like that sort of sounds naturally in there. And I like the idea of ADS having a say in how that data governance goes, how it comes in, where it goes out, because that's their skill set. I do also feel like there needs to be some like legislative representation, given that this is forming because the legislature wants this to be formed, and I feel like it could be very helpful to have the legislature be able to pose some research questions. So I'm wondering if there can be some type of multi-faceted working group. Like we were talking about an advisory group that included stakeholders. What about if those stakeholders included folks, a representation from the legislature? And I don't know, not too sure how the branches work, but maybe some representation from the judiciary branch also, you know, so like it's sort of like a collaborative effort in making sure that we have research questions being placed by everyone in Vermont, and also that the administration is being done by the administration.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I just got lost, Witchy, and I'm just sitting here thinking about it and not running the meeting. It's okay. I'll get it. Thank you. Rebecca, do you want to go now?
Sure. You know, Evan, when you started the conversation with going directly with where should this be housed, I was sort of finding my footing and hearing others' comments about it. I think really where I zeroed in on both of these documents that Eitan sent out for us this week. And again, Eitan, I do also appreciate you pulling all these thoughts together. Here's, and I love it, here's where I highlighted a key phrase that I think can center us in the discussion, where whether we want to go to the entity placement, and I think Monica or someone else said, well, it depends on what we're doing. Eitan, I'm looking at, if you guys have the first page of Eitan's document, and it's the first paragraph, you know, he starts saying the charge of the Bureau is to collect blah, 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 right? If you go to the second, and that's the last sentence, it's the last phrase, with the intent, right? So now we're getting to what is the purpose of this Bureau. And the way I read how this is written, I think that then gets us to looking at back to our constant theme, which is independence. A reminder, my recollection of 2 weeks ago or the third week, Susanna shared that there was draft legislation and then the legislation that passed creating, you know, her directorate, and how she shared that it wasn't as independently conceived as it was in draft form. And so I thought that was a useful red flag. Again, just avoiding sort of, let's go to the easy place to where this lands, and thinking first, what is our intent for this data? For me, it certainly is more than just having access to it. I don't think there's enough safety for the people who's represented in here and the interest by just that too vague of a statement.
Okay. Thank you. Evan.
Thanks, Eitan. I just wanted to follow up on what Witchy said because, you know, one, I agree with him, but two, it was actually the mention in Eitan, your draft about having, what was it? Maybe it was called an advisory panel or a governing body that made me first think back to Susanna's office because there is a racial equity advisory panel and it has to include a member appointed by the Committee on Committees who's not a current legislator, a member appointed by the Speaker of the House who's also not a current legislator, a member appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who's not a current legislator, appointment by the governor, and then an appointment from the Human Rights Commission, both of whom cannot be current legislators either. So it seems like some of the entities that he identified or contemplated, the legislature, the judiciary, so on and so forth, you know, maybe that if Susanna's office is going to take on the bureau, whatever it ends up being called, you know, maybe that panel, how that panel is put together needs to be changed or modified, because my recollection was the same as Rebecca's, that Susanna said the independence language could be beefed up. And I think we could certainly make that a recommendation if this is where we're headed. But again, that was sort of another similarity that I recognized, you know, a governing body for this entity, and there's already a panel for Susanna's entity. And, you know, maybe we need to make her entity a full department, you know, within another agency, and her position would be a commissioner. I don't know how the final format would be, but I imagine it could be beefed up in some respect to address her concerns. So that was my thought.
Okay. Witchy?
Mine is less of a comment right now, more of a question, which I think maybe Evan was starting to answer, but sort of, you know, Rebecca's introducing. And it's like, how then would, you know, if we're trying to learn lessons from what created the Office of Racial Equity, and we want to make it more independent, how does that look like? Like, how would we, if we were to redo it again, what would we do differently?
That's a pretty darn good question, and my thought would be let's talk to Susanna about that a little bit and see if she has any thoughts, because she's living and breathing it right now. You know, I would hate to be too presumptuous and come up with solutions to the problem she's identifying without talking with her.
Rebecca, you had your hand up, and then Susanna.
No, I'm sorry, Susanna, it makes sense. I'll wait for you. You should go.
Okay, Susanna.
Okay.
Good evening.
So I've been here. Good evening. I've been quietly listening here. So yeah, I have a few thoughts. Number one is I would say that if we want to seek a greater degree of independence than what exists now for the Racial Equity Office / Director, then one of the things we need to think about is fiscal support and how we're going to make sure that that's firmly in place. Because one thing that I found is that with independence also comes kind of like, oh, you're out of sight or you're less in sight, and then you might be, I'm trying to put this really diplomatically, but when budgeting time comes around, you may not necessarily get the same attention that you might get if you were under someone or something. So, and that's not a reflection of anybody in any position currently in government, but it's just a reality of how our budgeting process works in this state. So one thing that I would think about is, and I'm thinking about, like the Human Rights Commission is always understaffed and is always telling us that they're always understaffed. And yet, you know, who's factoring that in when we're building a budget every year? So I would caution us about that. The other thing I would say is, I agree with Rebecca's point about it's not just about creating access, it's about what is that access supposed to get us or get the public? Is it just proof that our hands are clean because of transparency, or is it actually going to serve a greater purpose by helping to A, inform the public's understanding of what we're doing, and B, inform policy itself? And if it's about informing policy, then theoretically, we don't need the access, right? Because if we have our own data, we can just use it to make good decisions. So clearly, I think it has to be both, right? It's a yes and. So I agree with that point. And there's a whole lot that you all talked about that made my eyes flutter, but I can't remember any more of it. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. I guess.
Eitan, could I?
Yeah.
Could I?
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
I
can wait.
Evan, when you said like what you rattled off the stakeholders who are involved in and Susanna, I have some crazy mind block over the name of your director, and so I'm so sorry. I just result in just call it your office, and I like that, anyways. But Evan, you were rattling off by statute some of those names, and then you said, how can we make this better, right? What are some thoughts? I think for me, immediately what comes to mind, whatever we call it, I'm thinking of it as the governing board, right? The governing board is the core. It is driving the direction of what the executive director, or essentially, Susanna, whoever it is who's running it, right? It's directing that person. So then who's on this board? And I think it's critical that it's not just the people or those organizations and the leaders within those organizations, state organizations that you listed. We need also, of course, I didn't hear the Defender General's office in there. We didn't hear any sort of the stakeholders that are involved in RDAP, but critically, we need community members at that table with an equal voice, and also people with lived experiences, which are not necessarily one and the same, right? And we need those numbers to not just be a token number, right? I think that we should think about how that board will be sitting, voting, thinking the questions. It's the checks and balances in and of itself to make sure that what we're hoping people do with this data, and I appreciate, Susanna, what you said, going further, it's not just transparency, it's building more informed policy decisions. And I hope we can get to an and, like, what are we hoping these policy decisions will be doing, right? Like, our whole point is addressing white supremacy in these systems, right? We certainly don't want this data and the policy to be used to further entrench, right? To add a different nuance to the same old. So I think that's where I'd hoped us to go. Very bold statement, similar to where we were with our reporting earlier. It's certainly what we do. Keep the focus on what the point of this is. I mean, certainly to me, why I am here on RDAP, I feel like we're doing something real in terms of trying to address this squarely and keep it front and center. Again, that is about being honest with how these systems are systems of entrenched white supremacy, right? Institutional racism. So how do we want this access to data to address this, right? We should have that as guiding principles of this governing board.
Okay, give me one sec. Thank you. I just wanted to write that down, Rebecca. Karen?
Yep, I've got my hand raised because Robin can't raise hers, so I'm doing it for her.
Oh, Robin.
Hi. Yeah, so to Rebecca's points, back a few on intention and also what Rebecca just said. One thing that was missing out of the great stuff that you guys put together so far is exactly what's going to happen to the data once it's released. And Rebecca, I'm going to tell you, you're not going to be able to control what happens to that data. Once you put it out there in the public, someone's going to use it for whatever purpose they want to. But what you can do, and this goes to something that Eitan asked me to kind of bring up every once in a while, is somewhere get either the advisory panel or someone within the budget to have a certain amount of dollars that they give to independent researchers for analysis. I would ask, and I don't know if Susanna's shop has like attacked the whole contracting with the state and how that might not be an easy thing for everyone to do, but to limit the barriers that independent scholars and scholars of color have to accessing data for research and funds, making that process easier, and to have that kind of grant process be responsive to the board of directors, or whatever you want to call them, to a specific question, right? So like what we kind of talked about before, you want to know, are communities of colors being over-policed? So here's the data we need. The Bureau works with the ADS to get that data. The funding body that has a certain amount of money to give every year to outside researchers, that independence that you want, answers this question specifically related to dismantling white supremacy in the criminal justice system. Or, 10 years from now, if this advances beyond the criminal justice system to whatever, housing, employment, et cetera. So that's one thought. A technical thing that we haven't really talked about yet, but I want to put a footnote in, is this entity is going to have to wait a few years before it gets enough data to do analysis. And the reason for that is that every day we expunge records. And those records are expunged from the court, from Monica, from DPS. And to do analysis on records that have been expunged is already giving you a bias that we can't really quantify. So this entity needs to not be touched by the expungement statutes. It needs to not be the official record holder so that they can collect identified data, de-identify it, but merge it all again, across so that you have a clean data set that isn't touched by expungement. So while you're doing that, I just also want to point out that years for all of this to happen, for this legislation to pass, for the funding to get forwarded, for the data architecture to happen, people are still in pain. And to have the advisory panel, until you can fund statistical analysis, to fund qualitative analysis, to really start to collect information from participants in the criminal justice system about how they experience discrimination, for the idea of policy change, because it's going to be a long time before you get a math answer. And I don't know that we want to wait.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Evan.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate Robin's comments, but I wanted to go back to this question of the composition of the governing body, because I was struggling with it when I was thinking about it, to be honest, because in my mind, it's also connected to the question of independence. And I think if we're going to have a governing body, if we're going to have one, I think it's, there's sort of two questions. How do we make it sufficiently balanced? And, is it going to be an entity that can direct the Bureau to do something or advise the panel to do something? Because I think that one of the things that could negatively influence the Bureau's ability to influence policy is the perception that it's actually beholden to someone else, whether it's an entity in state government or stakeholders who have some sort of disproportionate representation on the panel. So and I don't have the answers to that. It's because I was struggling with it myself. So I'm more flagging that I think that the issue of independence should also be woven into our conversations about the composition of the governing body.
I just want to throw something in here that has been sort of creeping around in the back of my brain about what you're saying, Evan, for I don't know, a few months now, actually. And that is, again, I'm not sure that we need to reinvent the wheel here. And the reason I say that is because the wheel that has already been invented would be what used to be the Criminal Justice Training Council, now the Criminal Justice Council, that went into, I mean, there was a radical restructuring of that body. What, David, 2 years ago now?
It was only 9 months ago.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the pandemic. But there was where it had been 12 people, and all of a sudden it became 24. And then there were all these subcommittees which advise it that cannot make decisions on their own, but really exist solely to provide information for this newly grown, frankly, body that, and I think we're all still, I mean, I certainly sit on one of the subcommittees and I'm like still deeply confused. I mean, I sit there and I'm like, what am I doing? Who wants what? I mean, I'm not trying to be funny. I'm serious. I have moments where I like have no idea what is going on. But people are liking that. And so I guess what part of me is thinking is it might be good to look at the legislation that reinvented the Criminal Justice Training Council as the Criminal Justice Council, because certainly no one is standing around going, there's not enough representation from community members. No one is viewing that. That, for everything I have heard go on about the council right now, that is not a question. That's not coming up. So I'm wondering whether it might not be useful for someone to deputize themselves to go after that legislation and bring it forth to the working group. Because I think there may be a lot there that could be quite useful for us. The other thing that came up for me listening to you, Evan, earlier was it may be very useful to, in someone's free time when they're not lying on the couch eating bonbons, to look at the statute regarding Susanna's office and apply it to what we're trying to do here. That's all. Rebecca.
I wanted to, something that Robin said about that you can't control the data once it's out there. Now, of course, I understand what you mean. And of course, I didn't suggest that we could we could draft some legislation to prevent how people would interpret and use the data. But I think that we can do something more to ensure the responsible use of the data, recognizing that the ultimate policy decision makers are the legislators themselves, of course. We're not trying to step on the separation of powers. We talked, I just want to make sure we don't lose the thread from one of our subcommittee meetings. Susanna, I don't think you brought it up directly, but someone referenced the work that you've been doing what is the language? Essentially, like ensuring that any new law that is passed, and I saw this quickly, and I was just looking in my email queue, that it should be analyzed and considered what the impact is on furthering racial inequities or correcting racial disparities. It was something affirmative in the statement. I don't know, is that, oh, thank you. You see, you put something in the chat. And again, that's one example I thought of, Robin. Like there is, yes, of course we can't control out once it's out there, but we can guide the legislators in terms of what we want this data to be used for. We can also minimize the collection of certain data to make sure it's not too much, right? It turns into a surveillance situation where we can't protect the people who are actually the people behind the data in terms of their privacy.
And Rebecca, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I've been a big proponent for racial impact statements for, well, years now. And I think that they should be used. Again, putting that footnote there that it's going to be a while until you collect enough data that isn't touched by expungement.
Oh, right. I had another comment for that comment.
Yep.
So it does make me nervous about the comments about how long it will take to get to what we're talking about building, right? And I remember, I think it was Abby Crocker from UVM at some point talked about, we recognize this in our report. We identified all those decision-making points in the system. Then we narrowed it with some priority decisions within that huge basket. Abby Crocker and others have suggested, I know the Connecticut guy who came to talk to us about data, like start with what you know. Certainly that AISP document toolkit was saying, yeah, let's start with the low-hanging fruit. What's currently available? What are the high priority questions we want answered within our priority list, right? And so we have like the short, immediate, and with someone, which we were talking about the immediate, the intermediate, intermediate, long term, and in terms of the data collection and analysis. I feel like, Robin, that could address those issues, because I don't want to just be, we got to wait until we're at the end and have it all there before we can produce anything.
Sure. I guess, so there's only a few sources of data that aren't touched by expungement. And so if you start so there's already a data set that the judiciary gives to me, Monica, DCF, and VCIC. That report is already run. That report can start going to the Bureau once you set up all of the permissions, right? So that report is already there. You can start with what you know. If once it goes to the Bureau, if you say to the Bureau, don't expunge anything here, you can start to build a data set. To do some analysis, however, so if I refer to those of you who get to sit through Justice Reinvestment as well, right? So their statistician has 5 years worth of data, and she's telling the group, we're not going to be able to do racial disparities on a county level because there aren't enough people in the data set. And so she's going to do disparities on a statewide level, but that's not going to help how people down in the southern part of the state experience versus the northern part of the state, or to get to the very simple question of how counties look to things differently. So yes, there are data sets that you can start building on. That judiciary extract can be merged with the DOC public data on a regular basis to avoid some of the expungements that happen there. There are things that can happen, but I do want to be realistic about the time that it's going to take for an entity well-established and well-funded, and with the directives to do this, they won't start at least for, almost another year, right? So if you get this passed next session, goes into effect July 1, you can hire the people to do it. They start it in a year, right? So that's where my timing is coming in. And I just want to be realistic because there is, right, the idea that asking for more data is a very white supremacist act in and of itself, and not just listening to people. And that if you push for listening to people while you are building up these data sets to do an analysis for the questions you want answered, then I think you are hearing the people who want to speak instead of waiting for the data to be worked upon.
Thank you.
Yep.
Witchy?
Yeah, so I have two items that I want to sort of follow up on that Robin's been mentioning. I think the first is that about timing. I think regardless, whether we deal with because of expungement or otherwise, I think it'll take at least 2 to 3 years to actually build what y'all want or what we want. Things like this, infrastructure like this, just takes time to create a foundation for. Once that foundation is built, then it's a different thing. And and Robin, I don't know the work from your organization, and maybe you already have a foundation that the engineers or architects can sort of like cross over and use. But in my experience, it takes a few years in order for things like this to be even queryable. The second note that I wanted to make is that I really agree with Robin about collective people's narratives and that qualitative data while this thing is being built, not just so people are heard while these experiences are happening, but also because that is going to inform the data that's collected and how data is going to be analyzed. When we look at how data is traditionally analyzed and reported on, it almost always tells you what. Right, it'll tell you like there's a correlation, right, or there's like this that happens, or there's this disparity, but it never tells you how, or never tells you why. And that qualitative data is always so super essential to be able to tell that fuller story. And then it'll tell you, oh, we should probably get this data that we're not already collecting in order to help inform the why or help inform the how. So that's how I think that also can be useful.
Okay, that's important. Thank you. Oh, no, your hand was up. That's okay. Never mind. Anyone else? Or Rebecca, you've got.
Yeah, which I appreciate it, and Robin, and it's something we should. It's the language, like my familiarity with this world and is the limited, right? Because when I think of data, this whole project, it absolutely has to include the qualitative side, and that's sort of shorthand phrasing for the stories, the people who have lived experiences in these systems, to be able to explain and contextualize the data. And to me, absolutely, and maybe we haven't been clear or even come to a consensus on that point, but I think we cannot just go forward and push the sort of just numbers only, please. Even what we're talking about in terms of the governing body. So I appreciate that. I almost am thinking about how many different ways and places, again, referencing back to the AISP toolkit, how many different places and ways do we build in assurance of that voice, that it's not lost, and not just that it's heard, that it's weighted, that's included, right? It's not just considered, it's not just noted in a report, it's actually integrated into the whole thing. And I think that's another part of it, a key part, which is, I love that. Here's another question. I appreciate the 2 to 3 years. What if is it possible that if we agreed within our priority group, if we nailed down 1, 2, 3 questions, right? With assuming that data was available now, Robin, acknowledging the expungement issue, maybe that will be a different issue, which is that there might have to be some tweaking with the expungement legislation to allow for this to work in the future, right? But not getting bogged down in the mechanics, even though I understand that's a very huge, important issue. Does it make sense that we identify, again, referring to the experts here, because I've heard a little bit different, which is, again, seen Connecticut's example, which is not obviously the same what we're proposing. They don't have their own setup entity, but using existing data, can we find that falling within one of our set of priority questions or decision-making points that we were hoping to collect data on? Like, what if those match? And what if we were like, oh, then let's focus on those two? Could that be even faster within a year? Is that realistic? Could we use one tangible question as a way to build this?
So a year after, so let's start. So because in my mind, I'm thinking, let's start the clock a year after the legislation passes. Can we start the clock there? So that's what can be happening a year after the legislature authorizes this. So let's just start with July of next year. No, I mean, so when I went through about what data are being collected, one of the things that ADS has been working on and will need to be done, and which you may have a better way to explain it than I will, is, and this sounds awful, but it's what's called a master person index. And in Vermont, we've been very opposed to that for a very long time, that one number tracks us across all governmental systems. But we still need to identify that when I come in with, somewhere into the system, that I was the same person that came into the system before, or the same person that comes in after, and that when I get arrested under one name, that I'm the same name in the court system. So that master person index doesn't exist in Vermont. We have different numbers that everyone's identified with across the system, where we use what's called a string match, a technical way to match names and dates of birth across systems. So you have to build that connection. I gave you guys the same thing that Connecticut had based on the court data. I don't know how useful that will be, but you guys can go through it. It's in your report. And what there were some interesting, things in there. I think about how many people who go through the system who never end up with a conviction, right? So that's an important number there, but what you do with it, I don't know. So you can, but it's still going to take time.
Right.
And Witchy, do you understand what I'm trying to say? And maybe you can explain it better in English.
Yeah, the word that I use, at least in my technical environment, is conformance, which is what you're talking about. It's like, in order to be able to analyze things need to look the same, and they need to be comparable. And a lot of the foundation building is making sure that everything that's going to come in now and later has that ability.
Yeah. And just to give you an idea of how things change and why you need governance, many of you know that when the court system went to Odyssey, you changed the way you record the statutes, right? So now I've got data from 2005 when charge codes were introduced to now, and now you've switched to something else, and I still have data systems that use the old with the parentheses and things like that. So even just how you record the statute that somebody has been charged with, sentenced to, is different in every data system that's in place. And that's right. And so that needs to be formatted across so that you know what everyone's doing. It's not an impossible lift. It's just not something that's going to be done overnight.
Right. David and then Monica.
I think Monica might have had comments that were more directly relevant to this issue of data gathering in time, and so I'll defer to her.
Monica and then David.
Well, I don't know, David. That seems like a lot of pressure, quite honestly. I have a few things going through my brain right now, and really, I think for me, the question of the question actually is sort of like a rabbit hole. I don't honestly think it matters too much, and to me, it doesn't help answer the question as to where the Bureau should be housed. And I was looking at the bullet points that are on the second page of the document that you sent out, Eitan, because I think you know, in my mind, it's like, what do we need to answer, and what needs to get answered after the Bureau is really formed, you know? And some of the things that are on that bullet section are things that could be potentially answered, like in a 5-year strategic plan that was presented to someone that approved, right? What are the questions? What are we going to start with? How are we going to follow these best practices on sharing, integration, and analysis that have come up in multiple comments that people are making? Because maybe when the board or the Bureau gets created, that people that get hired to do this and can spend like 40 or plus more hours a week, you know, as full-time employees doing it, could actually figure it out with guidance that we give to them. And so that's sort of the level that I was at. So I don't know actually if I did have a real data related point to make, David, but thanks for letting me go.
David.
We've obviously been discussing a bunch of different things today that are kind of along different threads, which I think is totally fine. But I say that only to announce that the thread that I was going to pick up here was really more related to the definition of the mission. And Rebecca's talked a little bit about that. And I wanted to say first that I really like, actually, Eitan, what you've done here in the second sentence of the first paragraph after the summary of Act 65. I think that's a nice sort of general direction with enough removed to allow for a lot of work to be done within that. I think Rebecca's point is a valid one in terms of adding in one more clause, and I have not wordsmithed this at all, I'm just thinking out loud here, but one more clause related to the fact that we are doing this for the purpose of ameliorating racial disparity. That still leaves a huge amount of, you know, discretion within the Bureau and the Bureau's governing panel, but I think that's a valid point. I may not be, I hope I'm getting at it fairly. But I think it's a valid point that Rebecca's making about why, the why behind this, and I think encapsulating that in the mission wouldn't even add that many words to what you've written. But something along those lines would be reasonable. And then I also do think that this is a slightly different point, but related. I think that after we set the mission and set out some of these guidance ideas, I do think we may somewhat painfully have to step back and say, all right, now this is the Bureau's job, and it is the job of the governing body of that Bureau, which hopefully will have, and I think that is something we need to make clear in our message to the legislator, hopefully will have and needs to have community representation and representation from affected individuals. But it will be that body's job now to start setting priorities and deciding what are the first questions we're going to look at within this mission and things like that. And I think that's appropriate. You know, that we are here to set that up, to provide principles that will allow it to input from the people who it needs to have input from, and give it a mission, and then let it set sail, let it take flight. So just a sort of generalized thought about it. I think the mission's good. I think a little bit of an addition will help give it a sort of positive, purpose-driven idea to it, in addition to what's already there. And then the fact that I think there is going to have to be some allowance for this governance body to make some big decisions.
Okay. Witchy, is your hand still up and I just forgot to take it down, or do you have something else to add?
I just have something else to add.
Oh, good.
So I think first, just trying to fully answer Rebecca's questions here. I do think that 2 to 3 year is like kind of a hard, fast rule. I mean, you could really try for 1 year. but I think we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we would just end up creating a system that's not scalable. It's just really difficult to create a foundation without the appropriate time. The qualitative data collection, I agree that that is definitely something that needs to happen. That takes resources. So like time and designing, and especially if we don't already collect it. And if, yeah, qualitative data is a lot more complicated to store and for analysis, because it's like, how do you store a paragraph of somebody's story? Like, you know, you have to break it down. You have to like create some type of structure and architecture. And again, talking about conformance, like I said earlier. So it's doable. It's just like the more you ask of it and the more complicated you want it, the longer it takes and the harder it is.
Can I just address that point, Eitan, for a second?
Sure.
Yep, thank you. So as many of you may know, we put in for an earmark with Senator Leahy's office to do qualitative analysis of people in the southern part of the state who've experienced the criminal justice system of color. And this was done in conjunction with Curtis and the NAACPs. We put in our budget for that, and we're at the top of the list. We just are waiting to see if we go into a bill. Was I think what, Karen, 170, 180,000, just to give you an idea. And that was for the data collection, for the software to analyze it, and the state may get a cheaper deal on the software to analyze it than we do, and the time to recruit, the human protections that are involved in. We want to make sure nobody can subpoena our records, so we're going to apply for an exemption from the National Institute of Health to say racism is a public health crisis. It manifests in the criminal justice system. Nobody can subpoena my records because researchers are never exempt from you guys, from lawyers subpoenaing us, no matter how much. Like, right? We don't have an evidentiary privilege like attorneys do or counselors do or something like that. So those are the types of things that you have to do and consider when you're looking at qualitative research, and why you want to pair with a researcher who can go to the review boards and do all of that stuff. And independent scholars can, again, to my points that it can't just be me and UVM doing all the research in Vermont, that you want to expand this. But that's what you're looking at for a study on a small population in part of the state, was about 170,000.
Oh, great.
Which in the grand scheme of things is not actually all that expensive compared to the amount of research dollars that flow out of the feds. But that was what we put in for. It's a tight budget, and that also includes paying the NAACPs to help us recruit and other right. So there's all of this kind of stuff that goes into recruiting participants, so, you know, paying for child care if they need child care while we talk to them. All of those sorts of things go into that type of budget.
Right.
And food.
You know, Robin, oops, excuse me, Evan, go ahead.
Very a boring addition to the conversation. I just wanted to point out, Eitan, because I know that you're monitoring lots of different things, that I put a link to the act that reorganized the Criminal Justice Council in the chat. So if folks wanted to pull that later and take a look at it, it's there for those who would like it.
Thank you. Oh, thanks so much, Evan. Yay. All right, I have to go back to Rebecca.
Robin, your comments earlier and just now sort of reminded me, I didn't follow up with this question for you earlier. So I appreciate you sharing with us your pending proposal on Southern Vermont closer analysis. You also said earlier this evening that, and you've said this before at other RDAP meetings, and I fundamentally don't understand this, which is that we have too little data to analyze it at a county level. We can only do this at a state level, yet you're able to take certain analysis at a smaller than state level. To me, when I hear this, and it just may be how you're explaining it, as someone, and again, hearing Richie talk about how it is possible is just a different complicated animal that we have to separately source, which is the qualitative side. Isn't that where we can still analyze what is happening in Vermont, that we cannot exceptionalize Vermont just because of its rural, low population matter, that we can never trust them? Because to me, when I hear you say things like that, it's like we can't ever trust the data, we can't ever get to the bottom of it, therefore we can always point fingers to elsewhere to point to the blame of the source of the disparities. Now, maybe you can explain it for me, but that's how I hear your references, that we just are too small of a state to understand racial disparities at a smaller than state level.
So that was language from Sarah, the PhD who's doing the research for justice reinvestment. And so the way she explained it, and it's recorded, that was recorded, and I think Matt can get it to you if you haven't, in all your free time, listen to it.
I have.
Yeah.
That is also something that CRG has said in other reports, meetings.
Sure. So it's right. So if you go back to a few presentations ago, when I was showing you the numbers in various counties of non-white defendants for a 5-year period, and I said what happens is that Chittenden kind of puts a foot on the scale, and we don't collect a lot of data that will help enlighten, as Witchy was saying, about what the data actually means. So one example, so the reason why we applied for the earmark to study Southern Vermont is that Southern Vermont people of color in the data are smaller numbers than what we see in Chittenden County. And everyone tells us that Southern Vermont is fundamentally different. I don't live in either part of the state, so I don't know, but right, we hear this. And you use qualitative analysis, this kind of interviewing and coding of stories to get at policy solutions that wouldn't be there in quantitative data. So for example, the one that I always give is when I interviewed victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, what makes you unsafe? What makes you feel unsafe when they violate the restraining order, or you have to go to court? And what makes them feel unsafe in the county that I worked in to do this was Washington County. What makes them feel unsafe is the bus stop in front of the courthouse, because the abuser waits in the bus stop where he's allowed to be legally. It's the only way she can get out of the courtroom is to walk past him. That's what makes them feel unsafe. So that type of policy solution, move the bus stop, is never going to be available in the what did you plead out to, what was the circumstance of the plea, what were you arrested for, none of that, right? You only get those answers by talking to people. And you can get important answers and meaningful policy solutions from people that don't involve collecting the actual numbers or that numbers can't ever quantify. How do you feel safe? We don't ask that question in the data. But we can ask, how did you feel respected, or did you not feel respected when you went through the criminal justice system? That data we can ask in qualitative, and if you do your rigorous study, you can make policy decisions on it. So I don't think that I'm saying anything that's inconsistent with what I have said along. I think that it's the idea that when qualitative analysis is useful is when you have small numbers, when you want to get to really important aspects of the data that you can't collect regularly or want to. So that's when you would use that. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Robin. Yes.
Monica?
Just to give another example, you know, and I wasn't at the Justice Reinvestment meeting last week, but I've heard what Sarah's had to say and what CSG said. But also, you know, in the data that we've started to put out in corrections, and we've, you know, been trying to disaggregate it as much as we can at a race level. Sometimes, as Robin says, the more we break down and like do crosstabs and break down this by this and this by this, the numbers in the cells are so small that we're essentially identifying who that person is. And so, and we're talking about the whole Department of Corrections population. And so we're starting to, you know, combine, you know, BIPOC into one category so that we're not identifying people because the numbers are so small. And I think that's similar to what CSG is finding too, because people are curious and they're asking to break it down in ways, and the more and more you do that, the smaller and smaller the numbers are going to be. And from from the research perspective, that's difficult because then the protections aren't in place.
Right.
And that was something I know you brought up, Rebecca. So that's part of it too. If I said that wrong, Robin, just let me know.
Yeah, no, that's also part of it, is that if you go back to a few presentations ago when I pointed out that there were so few Indigenous people captured in the data, that, yeah, I mean, every time I have an asterisk, it's because I have to protect that person's identity, and there are a lot of asterisks in the data, even just for how many people were sentenced, how many people were charged with this crime, how many people were sentenced to this particular sentence. It does get, you know, when you start slicing it smaller and smaller and smaller, you risk identifying people, but you also can't make any policy suggestions without, you know, hearing the stories and how people felt about their experiences.
Okay. I have, oh wait, Rebecca, I've got like a big thing, which is a turn. So Rebecca, you go.
I just wanted to synthesize what I'm hearing so I just understand. The very small data presents the problem of assuring privacy, right? Which I understand. And that it makes it absolutely necessary to have the qualitative analysis to contextualize it. But can I just clarify this? If we could build whatever measures are necessary to ensure the privacy of these individuals who are subject and are greater risk of being exposed because of their sheer numbers, if we could build that, then the fact that we just have these small numbers doesn't mean we can't analyze and understand it. Again, assuming we have this qualitative analytical piece to it. Is that right?
Some researchers are not going to want to publish data with cells that are that small. So it really just, you know, it really just depends. And
you're saying that you can't make it protective enough?
It's not even so much protective enough. It's that, can you draw any conclusions?
Okay, but sorry to interrupt.
That's why the qualitative, and again, they're two different things. I think, so one of the benefits of the quantitative data is you can do over time, right? Metrics over time. How many, you know, so the data that I presented to you, for example, a few weeks ago was a 5-year snapshot. But what's a more interesting snapshot is year to year, you know, for some things that you want to measure. Sometimes you want to say the legislature makes a change and you want to measure the impact of that change. So they begin to, I don't know, they do something, we want to measure it. You can measure it over time with quantitative data for the most part. The qualitative part gets at different questions. And it makes a more complete policy picture for people to act on. I don't know that you need to prove with numbers what people can't tell you for themselves on their experience. Because one of the things that is not going to be captured in administrative data is this feeling of procedural justice and a feeling of being respected by the system.
But certainly it would be helpful to know that there's like 10 who had that same experience. And I just realized like where I'm having a disconnect with hearing you guys talk about we are always working with single people, right? A single particular fully contextualized set of facts relevant to the legal issues raised for the challenge below. That, and we're asking the court to make a decision based on a single person. I think I see this use of data a little bit differently. Like I don't see that there needs to be a trend before it's significant enough to act upon. I think that if there is 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, and again, and we contextualize it to provide some meaning, then isn't that how we give voice to all of these very few, relatively speaking, to other places, people of color in the state who are receiving various forms of injustice going through these systems? And so I guess I'll stop there.
So qualitative analysis doesn't need an N, a particular N. It does need the way it's analyzed, and I can send you, like, I don't know if it would be helpful if people saw like the computer software that we use to analyze these data, or some qualitative studies that have actually changed public policy. It gets to things at, so let's say Washington County has actually not moved that bus stop. That was how victims of domestic violence experienced the bus stop in front of the courthouse in Barrie. Let's say they did move it. I know one of the reasons why they didn't move it was because wheelchair access. So you can ask for a policy based on a few things, and then you move it and find out you didn't talk to everybody possible. So by documenting things in qualitative analysis allows this kind of broader policy discussion to happen about how, okay, so if we can't move the bus stop, how do we get you out of the courthouse safely? And we have further qualitative analysis in the states that we've done that have had that policy decision. You can, I don't know why you wouldn't want to do qualitative analysis or why there's like this hesitancy about it. It's been used for, I mean, I think of some of the really great, it's used a lot in education to change education policy, especially around race and marginalized folks. So yeah, I don't know how to make it any more accessible.
No, I'm not. I support qualitative analysis for sure.
Okay, Witchy, and then me.
Are you sure you don't want to go before me, Tom?
No, go for it.
Okay. Rebecca, I guess I just have a follow-up question on something that you said. You mentioned that you don't need to see a trend in order to bring something to, and I'm messing up the second part of this, but in order to bring it to policy or something like that?
I think, I should have clarified. I know you guys have, or you've been using an example of victims of domestic violence and what would make them safer in the bus stop. Let's bring it to an actual suggested discretionary collection point, which was how many, I think the charging decisions of a prosecutor, right? And let's say in that county with those prosecutors for the similar amount of cases, I don't know how we would control it, right? Again, how many are getting what types and levels of drug-related offenses, just misdemeanors, or how many are getting them to the maximum felony aggravated trafficking? Let's say then the numbers are in that county, out of 100, 98 are white, 2 are black. Are those number, and of the 2 that are black, those are the 2 that are charged with a maximalist mindset for prosecution, but it's only 2, right? But it was all black men who went through that prosecutor's office for whatever time period you choose, versus 98. From a data statistical analysis, my understanding is you would discount that because there's not a sufficient amount of data to conclude anything, right? From my perspective, I think that's absolutely significant, right? And so I guess that's where I'm having the disconnect with sort of the discussion here, with where the data is too little.
I think in that particular example, and I'm really glad you used that example because I understand a lot clearer now what you're trying to say. I think in that example, what becomes dangerous is who's looking at that and who's allowed to look at that. Because if you're saying that only 2 were prosecuted to the maximum, right? And you're like, here prosecutors, or here people, it's like all of a sudden, okay, well those people now know who those 2 are, right? Like it's like all of a sudden it's identifiable, and then it becomes a privacy and security issue. Yeah, I wouldn't say that would be the case in all cases, but that would definitely be one of the biggest risks in having such a small amount of a sample.
Okay, it's my turn now. Couple things. First, I want to point out that we're getting up on 7:30 and we have to talk about action points for next week, okay? I put a few out there earlier in conversation and I didn't know whether people liked them or didn't like them or had others or what, but I think we have to work on that. The other thing that I want to raise is that points 4 and 5, how the Bureau should conduct data collection and analysis, and the best methods for the Bureau to enforce its data collection and analysis responsibilities, is something that a group that, Karen, you were, and I'm invoking you because there's a group that's ready to go on that would include, I believe, Mo Stein. And my first question, I guess, is it time to get that group going?
Well, Eitan, I think that's why we were going to meet with you briefly, the few of us that bridge both groups, so we could talk about that and then present it to this whole study committee. And I think we actually have that scheduled. And I was going to invite Kristen. I think we do. I can't remember. I was trying to remember if I actually ended up rescheduling it. But I was going to see if I could invite Kristen McClure to that meeting just for a few minutes to get her engaged in the whole data integration conversation.
That would be lovely.
Yes, and so I will keep trying to get that small group together to talk, and then we can bring it back to this group and to NCJRP has already said, yes, it's all aligned together. We're happy to have you guys doing the data integration work. And I think one of the questions we had too, that I did send David an email, was, and I've checked with a couple of the judges too for the Sentencing Commission on a different issue, was do we have to notice the meeting because it's a subcommittee of a legislative body? So if we do it as NCJRP, we don't have to. If we do it as RDAP, we do. So that was my thought. And I don't have maybe the AG's office can notice the meeting. I don't have that capability.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So that's going to be taking place. Everybody should know that. That's going to be taking place separate from this. Not that you're not invited. It's just
no, and we'll invite people. I mean, it's not an exclusive group at all. In fact, we'd like Richie to be there. He's very savvy about all this data integration stuff, so it'd be great to have him there.
Right. All I was saying was I just wanted to point out this isn't exclusionary. It's simply this is where other work is going to be happening on this, so you all know that. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
The other point I wanted to raise is, do we want to look at first of all, the statute that created the office of the Executive Director of Equity, and look at how that plays into what we've already written for today. Do we want then also to look at the enabling statute that Evan has put into the chat that designed the, God, I'm sorry, it's been a long day, the Criminal Justice Council, and see how that interfaces with what we've already proposed here. Because we've been discussing the governing body, the makeup of the governing body, the fact that we didn't want to tokenize people on the governing body, all those issues. That's in there. I remember that being in there. So I guess what I'm saying is, if we're going in that direction, I'd like people to volunteer to do that work. I can't do all of this. Is what that's what's coming to here. I just wanted to say, I'm willing to do a lot of this, a lot of putting it together, but I also, I need other folks to look at some of that stuff and do some of this accretion, as it were, that I did with this particular thing. And if that's where we're going, I'd like people to volunteer. Having said that, Evan, you have your hand up. Evan, you are muted.
I was saying I'm glad you repeated those two tasks because I couldn't remember exactly what they were when you were soliciting volunteers. I also had another suggestion, and Monica, I'm not trying to steal your idea. I'm trying to agree with it, but you know, I think one thing that might help us is trying to figure out what level of detail we want to include in our answers to these questions, because I think Monica was right when she said at a certain point, the entities that the people that are going to staff this bureau are going to have to provide more complete answers to these questions. And I think David was right when he was saying at a certain point, we're going to have to be willing to let go of the reins and hand them over. And it sounds to me, as I attend these meetings, that there's a lot of common ground in principle amongst the participants in this group. And if there's a way to answer some of these questions based on those principles, maybe that's a productive use of our time. But then also, Eitan, to your specific question, I'm happy to help look at either the Criminal Justice Council legislation or Susanna's legislation and try and provide some type of analysis. I'm a little hesitant to promise that I can have something done by our next meeting on Monday because I've got a public records request I need to deal with, but I can make an effort to do some of that and report back. You just let me know what you want me to focus on, and I'll do my best.
Evan, why don't you focus on the statute for the executive director?
Sounds good. I can do that.
I am trying desperately to unmute someone right now, and I am having a horrible time. I don't know what is happening with the computers tonight. Rebecca needs to talk, and I can't unmute her.
I think it's Henry. Henry's happening. Henri.
Oh. I was like, Henry, who the hell is Henry? And now my hand is up and I don't want it up. Oh God. All right. Rebecca, I'm working on it, but I'm not done. Okay, so that's one thing, is to look at the enabling statute for that office. The other one would be around looking at why do I keep doing this? Criminal Justice Council. Good God, I'm blocking and looking and seeing if that has any relevance to talking about what the governing body that we're talking about does. Because I guess I'm making that point because it already exists. People spent an enormous amount of time on this. I just remember that being a huge lift about not tokenizing, not, bringing enough people in who actually are not insiders into any of the criminal justice system, who would be able to stand outside and look at it and ask questions that people within it would not necessarily ask. That was really critical in its design. I don't know, David, has it been working?
Eitan, oh, sorry, go for it, David. My apologies.
I was just going to say, having been on the council before and in its new iteration, I think it's been a huge improvement in terms of bringing in a lot of voices that should be heard in these deliberations. So yeah, I mean, is it working? Might be too more. I may not be able to give an answer that definitive, but I do think it's a really significant improvement, and it's a much more holistic set of voices that we have in that room, which I think has been very valuable.
Great. Okay.
What I was going to add, Eitan, is if I'm going to be sort of taking a global look at Susanna's enabling legislation to see if it answers any of these, could help us answer any of these questions, or how we might be able to adopt it for our purposes, since it has a section on an advisory panel, I can't imagine I won't be looking at the Criminal Justice Council recent legislation as part of that exercise. They're somewhat intertwined, so I can try and do that as well.
Great, thank you, Evan, and bless you. Rebecca wants everyone to know, because I can't unmute her, she's going to try to connect with the Secretary of State's office on the fourth point, how the Bureau should conduct data collection and analysis. And she also wants to make sure that we can bring Abby Crocker into this discussion, which is critical. She's one of the people that Act 65 says needs to be brought in, and we really ought to be able to mine some of her thinking there. She asks also, Karen, can you send out notice of the Parallel Pop project that we were talking about earlier?
Yes.
Okay, great. She wanted to know if someone from ODG, Office of the Defender General, right? Great, I got it. Okay. Is someone from the Office of the Defender General going to be there?
They're not, but Marshall is on the NCJRP team. He hasn't been attending in quite some time, but he is on that team. And I think Matt gets the notices too.
Okay. Monica, you had your hand up and then it went down. Was that the storm, or was that you?
That was me.
Okay.
I decided I didn't have a fully formed thought, which sometimes doesn't stop me, but it did today.
Oh, okay. All right. This all just feels like it needs to be in the direction that we need to go, to sort of solidify some of the stuff that this policy, this thing I contrived from everything that people wrote and sent to me. You're all kind of going, all right, it needs to go in this direction. So I'm just trying to give it some shape here and sort of say, all right, so for next time, let's go in this direction and start giving it that shape. I will myself look at that sentence that both Rebecca and David brought up the second sentence of the first paragraph and speak more directly to what the reason for collecting data is, basically to get more specific, which was what Rebecca was asking for, right? Okay, yeah, this is ridiculous. I'm sorry, Rebecca. What is the intent for the data? I'm going to do all that, yes, because Rebecca has a really hard time speaking for herself. So I will get on that for this week. I will do that. Susanna, you had
Eitan,
your
if you
hand up.
want, Eitan, if you want, I can help you synthesize that.
I would love that, Karen.
Okay.
I would love that.
Okay.
Because I have about 12 hours of teaching to do this week.
Okay. Let's touch base and just find a time to talk, and we can get that done pretty quickly.
I would love that. That's great.
Okay.
Tyler, haven't heard from you a lot. Hi.
I've been quiet. I've been trying to synthesize a great many points coming from a lot of directions and catch up at once. But it seems to me that so much of what we're talking about does boil down to that second sentence that I agree we need to add a little bit more to. And it seems like that second sentence really gets to question number 3, which is what should the scope of the Bureau's mission be? I think I think that's a thing that our group, it feels like we're relatively in the same place on, and that's a thing that can be pinned down first. And then the other pieces will make more sense with that. And I think we're actually quite close to a solution on that one.
Okay, I do too.
From my perspective.
I also want to point out that just to make us feel better about ourselves, because I think that's good, about 5 months ago, we had 8 possible locations for this thing. 8. I can't remember all of them, but I want to say it was 8. I remember it was 8. We are now clear that it needs to be a state government organization for housing it, and we have very clear reasons for why we believe that. And we all came at it from different directions. And I think that's really interesting, that it came from different directions, but we all got to a very similar place for similar reasons. So just think about that for a bit. That also says to me we've done a lot of work. So I just want to put that out there. Good. We've got forward motion here. I'm happy. You know me. If I don't feel like we're going somewhere for the next meeting, I get anxious. Other comments, questions? Seriously? Okay. I'm thinking of, you know, who always has something, Sheila? Sheila, is there something we're missing that you're gonna it's gonna occur to you at 2 in the morning and you're not gonna sleep and then you'll send me a text?
Well, I can't guarantee about the 2 in the morning text, but right now I'm feeling like you summed it up really well, that everybody came to this at a different angle, and I think multiple people addressed a variety of things that I was thinking about or might needed to have had said. And so I don't need to repeat the wheel, and thank you for giving me the space.
Got it. Okay, then.
I do
Guy?
Eitan, before we go, I had one other thought that's been bubbling as I've been thinking about this that might be helpful or might not. So discard if it's not helpful. I kept going back and reading what the bill is asking us to do in the development of this bureau, and I kept comparing that to what this scope is that we're talking to, and I understand also wanting to make sure we're guiding that purposefully, but I guess the thing that I keep thinking about is remembering what is the differentiation between what the Bureau does between what RDAP is supposed to do, what Susanna's shop is supposed to do, because I think sometimes we start mixing those things together and that makes our projects complicated. And so I don't know if it's helpful at all to think in terms of being able to differentiate, is this bureau have a specific and clean purpose that is different from RDAP's purpose at large, and how do those relate to each other?
Let me just point out here, and I don't know whether this will help you with this, Tyler, or not. When Coach and Martin Lalonde were working on this, I got very protective of the RDAP. I had a lot of moments when they were, when Coach first came and said, I'd like you all to be the advisory body. I got really hot under the collar and said, this is not the RDAP that does data. It is the RDAP. You asked us to do some work on data. We did work on data. We are not a data body. If you wanted a data body, you needed to get a whole bunch of other people on there, none of whom are on there. Because this is not the RDAP that does data. And he agreed, and we went to this point, and I was a little uncomfortable with it, but I'm working with it, I think this is just where we're at right now, and we shouldn't take it as anything more than contingent.
I guess what I'm getting at, Eitan, is I hear that. Thank you for that. What I think I'm getting at in my head is, if this body is people who have the capacity to work with data, to do research, to make sure questions are asked in a thorough, purposeful, thoughtful way, that I see the Bureau, right, as that body who's doing that. I see the RDAP as a body that says, I am going to ask you this question. How do I get to these answers? I'm going to pose this thing, and our Bureau of Racial Statistics is able to say, here is how I can work with you towards getting to the answer, or something along those ways. That's where I see a little bit I see the Bureau as being a little bit more living in the data side of the equation. The RDAP is asking, how do we get this policy question answered? Do we need qualitative data or quantitative data to get to an answer to this question? So on and so forth.
Well,
does that make sense?
Sure. And if you look at the last bullet point, it's directing the mission of the Bureau or the data entity or whatever we're calling it. We got to get there too. What are we calling the damn thing? Review the reports of the advisory panel on racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice systems to incorporate its recommendations into the strategic plan, that plan being for the Bureau itself.
Yeah.
Does that help?
It does help me, thank you. And I'll stop talking while I start formulating this, because I know we're close to the finish line, and I stopped us.
Well, I mean, oh God, you're right. It's 10 minutes. Okay. But you also should know, I mean, in case you don't, Tyler, we are technically supposed to write all else being equal, every 2 years we write a report. It's been every year, but theoretically, it's supposed to be every 2. So but yeah, that's there, and that maybe that needs to be strengthened, in fact. Because I don't want this to be the RDAP that does data. It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's absurd. So I think we all know where we need to go this week and what we need to do. Thank you very much for yet another very, very productive meeting, even though I couldn't unmute Rebecca. Thank you. And I'll see you all next week. Bear in mind, by the way, that the 6th of September is a Monday, and it is also Labor Day. Just bear that in mind. We're going to have another holiday.
And
I totally
Eitan, just to
lost.
let you know, that's
Go
also
ahead.
Erev. Yeah, that's also Erev Rosh Hashanah, because you said you forget these things.
Oh my God. Well, there it is. And again, the bad Jew. I can't remember a damn thing about the high holy days.
That's what you have me for.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're
And
welcome.
at Rosh Hashanah, and you would think I would, yeah, no, I'm going to Jew hell. In any event, I just wanted you all to know that's a holiday for a lot of reasons. So we won't be meeting then. I will talk to you all shortly. Thank you all for volunteering to do the work that you're going to be doing. And please be in touch as that goes on. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I cannot ever receive too much email or too many texts. I know that sounds crazy, doesn't it? It's to me too, frankly. But I mean it. So thank you. See you all next week. Be well.